Welcome to this week's Clean Earth Energy Podcast. Once again, my name is Mark Weich. There's a lot to talk about in this one, so once again, I've got my trusty iPad to keep track of notes. But before we get started, if the lighting looks a little bit funny in this video, it's because for the foreseeable future, considering that there's an energy crunch right now worldwide, we're going to be shooting these videos as efficiently as possible, meaning battery powered lighting and the use of natural lighting, as you can see behind me. So we think that we can do our part to do these podcasts and these videos as efficiently as possible. So this is an example that we're going to use for quite some time. We'll transition as the situation or as the conditions call for it, but as it stands, we are going to be shooting these videos with natural lighting as much as possible. Okay, so let's get to it. So this week, there's a lot to talk about. I want to focus on the US and the European Union in this video. There's a lot that's happening as it relates to renewable energy, the energy transition, uh, things that are focused on the industry, but there are a lot of political motivations as it relates to the recent developments, the recent announcements from countries in the European Union as well as the United States. So I want to take a look at that and some of the sort of implications around that. But let me first start off by saying is this is going to be sort of quite a turning point, in my opinion. Uh, I can't think of something, let's say, sort of the industrial revolution, maybe the information age. Now it looks like the green energy age we're sort of making that transition to, or that we're embarking upon. So what I want to get into this week is first with the United States. So the most recent news being from the Biden administration, the Department of Transportation specifically. So the Department of Transportation has laid out some guidelines for a national EV charging network. Now, this is an extension of the Biden-Harris administration announcement that they are going to build a network of roughly 500,000 or 500,000 electric vehicle chargers across the United States. So, what's the premise behind that? Really to improve EV charging infrastructure, which is desperately needed around the world. And secondly, to ensure a consistent experience for EV owners. That's currently not the case. One, in terms of trying to find EV chargers, and two, trying to find EV chargers that work. And then there's also the biggest one that really makes a lot of people hesitant about buying EVs, and that is range anxiety. So, those are the three pillars as it relates to why the Biden administration is pursuing this particular sort of initiative in rolling out 500,000 EV charging stations across the US in a network. Um, the other component as well is that there have been record sales of electric vehicles in China, in the European Union, and now the US is following suit as the third biggest market for electric vehicles. And certainly the infrastructure needs to be there to support sort of this rapid growth of the EV industry. Predominantly, it's been Tesla, but now we have Ford with the F-150 Lightning, the Mustang Mach-E. We've got Volkswagen with their ID lineup. We've got Mercedes-Benz, BMW, and Audi, and so on. So it is certainly time that this is addressed meaningfully at the national level. Now, certainly, there will be some who argue private industry should sort of lead the way on these types of initiatives, but this is an example of government really sort of setting the mandate. So that's all well and good with being able to sort of set a policy for an EV charging network nationwide. But the Biden administration and the US Department of Transportation have laid out some guidelines for EV charging. And what that entails is that there must be first a certain quality level of EV chargers. So those chargers are to be professionally installed. They must also be American manufactured EV chargers as well. And so there is a qualification process. In terms of the procurement, there's preference given to American supplied EV charging equipment. So that's very important to understand. The other thing to understand as well is that there is the service level, a minimum uptime of 97%. Is mandated for this EV charging network. So that's a pretty high number to strive for. I don't have the metrics on sort of what the current sort of EV availability, EV charging availability is, but it's not good, especially having spent some time with an electric vehicle. I've had some situations where I've been very low on remaining range. I set a particular EV charging station destination into my GPS, only to find when I get there that the charging station does not work. And that is a very, very alarming situation to be in if you're an EV owner and you have minimal range left, especially when you might be traveling, or it could be late at night and there is not another EV charging station nearby. So that's going to be very interesting sort of service level that not the EV charging equipment manufacturers have to maintain, but the states who participate in this EV charging network, they will be responsible for the service level of 97% or greater. Uh, that's going to be very interesting. The government sort of taking a role in something like this, how well that works in practice, difficult to say. So something to watch carefully. We know that as it relates to fuels or sort of fossil fuels, the government has some standards in terms of the sort of composition of fuels as it relates to seasonality, carbon emissions from vehicles. And now it looks like they're trying to establish something similar in the electrification realm. Let's see how well it works, but surely it is an interesting development for this national EV charging network. Just some more other details to share with you on that is the chargers must be connected. They must be part of a network. So if you think Tesla Supercharger or EV Go or Electrify America, these EV chargers must be part of some sort of network that people can rely on to be able to identify EV charging stations nationwide. There must also be interoperability standards. And so, as it relates to charging types, so you have CCS, you have Charimo, and you also have Tesla's connector as well, which is a proprietary connector. So, it will be very interesting to see what the support is for the various connector types as well. And then finally, these EV charging or this EV charging network must be open to third parties to develop software for. So, so once again, thinking about the GPS in an automobile and being able to locate nearby EV chargers, um, there must be some sort of accommodation for third party software developers to be able to access protocols or APIs within the national EV charging network to be able to extend that to sort of a broader consumer base. So, very interesting development. That's sort of a smaller part of what I want to talk about. There's a lot to talk about today. So I want to get on to more from the Biden administration. So I talked about in a couple of weeks ago in one of my previous podcasts about sort of a halt on import of solar panels from countries in Southeast Asia. So that would be Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia. The concern was that China was routing their panels produced in China through these countries and then exporting them to the U.S., which would be a violation of Department of Justice solar tariff import rules for Chinese-made solar panels. Again, you can go back to the previous podcast. I'll put a link to it in that. So the Biden administration has effectively put a 2-year moratorium on any solar panel tariffs. And why has he done that? Well, it's currently boom times in America for the solar panel industry. There are several solar projects currently in play inside the US. So as it stands right now, there's 7.5 gigawatts of installed solar panel capacity inside the US, and the target is for 22.5 gigawatts by 2024. So, effectively, the Biden administration's climate targets for solar panels, as well as his targets for the end of his first term. So, there are several implications for his climate agenda if there were any sort of obstruction or interruption of current solar activity within the United States. The other thing too is that he's effectively protecting the solar industry, which has been battered over the last 10 years due to competition from China dumping in the US market. And so he is preventing sort of a faltering of that industry in light of what has happened over the past 10 years due to the situation with China. Uh, the biggest thing to understand about the solar panel industry in America is that a lot of what drives that industry is installation. So, solar panel installers are the bulk of the solar panel industry or the solar energy industry in the US. So, if you put any halt on import of solar panels, you are effectively halting the ability for solar panel installers to do their jobs. And that has huge implications as it relates to the labor market, obviously, as it relates to the American economy. So Biden has decided that he is not going to risk that and that he is going to let it be sort of business as usual as it relates to the solar panel industry. And frankly, there's just tremendous upside to having a robust solar panel industry inside the US. Um, and of course, politically, that again sort of complements his climate agenda. So, very interesting to sort of see him maintain that as well. So, we've talked about as it relates to EV charging infrastructure and the solar industry. Now, let's move on to the wind industry in the US. So, lots of developments as it relates to the wind industry in the U.S. So currently, there are several sort of onshore wind energy installations in the U.S. Texas being the biggest, California being number two. But California, as I mentioned a few podcasts ago, has an offshore wind target of up to 45 gigawatts by 2030. So what's happening now is that the Biden Harris administration are getting ready to open a lease auction for offshore wind energy in the state of California, roughly in central California. I believe that area, if I'm not mistaken, is Morro Bay in California. 375,000 acres that they're looking at opening up for auction. And that translates to roughly 4.5 gigawatts of installed solar capacity. What does that mean? Well, that means it can power 1.5 million homes in the state of California. And it also is an opportunity to create thousands of jobs in the state. And again, as I mentioned in one of my previous podcasts, that doesn't even begin to address the green tech sort of aspect of offshore wind or wind energy in the state of California. So it looks like California is beginning to mobilize on its offshore wind aspirations. And again, with the Biden climate agenda, he and Vice President Harris are beginning to start to open up these sort of areas for bidding by offshore wind developers. So something very interesting to see there. Okay, so moving on to New York City, talked about offshore wind, and New York City, New York State has an offshore wind target of 9 gigawatts by 2035. In order to achieve that goal, there needs to be port facilities to support fabrication, manufacture, and transportation of offshore wind components, meaning monopiles, wind turbine blades. So, New York City is exploring areas around Staten Island and Brooklyn to establish portside facilities for the transportation of these components. And the reason that's important is because along the Hudson and East Rivers, there are many bridges, and because of the sheer size of wind turbine components and the supporting structures, certainly obstruction of bridges is not helpful, adds to the cost, adds to the complexity of offshore wind projects. So, some areas in Staten Island and Brooklyn have been identified. These areas decades ago were previously port areas for industrial purposes, but due to changing economy and market conditions, those areas have been abandoned. And now it looks like there's an opportunity to resurrect those areas and one, bring new industries back to areas that were once vibrant, and also as it relates to job creation in New York City, New York State, and then also revitalizing communities as well. So, offshore wind, beyond the sort of benefits as it relates to carbon emissions reduction for New York State and its climate change goals, certainly the economic considerations as it relates to the manufacture, fabrication, and transport of offshore wind components. So certainly something interesting to watch. I found that article via the Gothamist, and if you're interested in reading that, you can find a link to it. I've posted it on my Twitter. So continuing on with offshore wind, so we talked about the United States, two biggest states, New York and California, with their offshore wind aspirations, but there are some interesting developments out of the Gulf Coast, meaning Texas and Louisiana. So the Biden administration and also the Department of Energy are looking at the Gulf Coast region for offshore wind. Now, that's very important because the Gulf of Mexico already has a big influence on American weather patterns. And so, if you can imagine putting offshore wind farms in the Gulf of Mexico, there's huge wind energy generation potential in that region of the country. And so, the Biden administration and supporting agencies are looking at a potential of 30 million acres dedicated to offshore wind in the Gulf of Mexico. I talked about Morro Bay in Central California earlier. So if we talk about the Gulf Coast potential, just or in comparison to Morro Bay, we're talking a 100-fold increase in opportunity in the Gulf Coast region. And so that's huge potential. Now, the energy generation potential is just one part of it. But if we look at the states of Texas and Louisiana, certainly they can't leverage all of that energy, at least when we talk about the sheer potential of it. So then we start to look at the development of grid scale storage as it relates to battery storage, for example, or green hydrogen production. So some huge opportunities that relates to green hydrogen and battery storage as it relates to the development of those industries. But then we could be potentially looking at utilizing that energy generation for neighboring states in the Southeast region. So if we talk about Florida, Georgia, Tennessee, and Arkansas, there are potentially some huge opportunities as it relates to supplying energy to those states. And then also, if we look at what it means for local economies as well, in terms of the facilities that are needed to support the offshore wind industry, also installation of vessels, installation vessels to transport these items out to sea. So the Gulf Coast represents a huge opportunity for the United States. Now, beyond the huge opportunity, the Gulf Coast region, the Gulf of Mexico, is one of the world's largest areas for oil and gas exploration. And considering the increasing caps that are being placed on oil and gas exploration worldwide, either through national mandates by various countries or even through private industries where some oil and gas companies are beginning to decrease their operations or abandon oil and gas exploration in certain parts of the world altogether, have to really sort of consider the implications for local economies as well as the labor market in these industries. So the thinking is to leverage the know-how of the oil and gas industry in the Gulf Coast region and begin transitioning that over to offshore wind. One, you're taking the know-how and the experience of the labor force in oil and gas and transitioning that to the offshore wind industry. You're also really training people for a new set of skills. So that's prolonging their careers. and also it is sort of protecting the sort of vitality of local, state, and the national economy as it relates to labor and ultimately the economic benefits that it provides to being able to have a skilled workforce in a new and growing industry. So some huge opportunities there as it relates to the offshore wind industry, and then just the acceleration of offshore wind altogether, being able to take the know-how from oil and gas and applying it to offshore wind. Offshore wind is very complex, and so therefore there's not an abundance of skills available to be able to do these types of installations, and certainly leveraging the complexity and the skill of the oil and gas exploration business can only be helpful to the United States motivations as it relates to the development and expansion of offshore wind. So let's keep an eye on that. So I've talked a lot about the U.S. as it relates to its various initiatives as it relates to electric vehicles, solar energy, and now offshore wind. So what we have is really sort of an example of the Biden climate agenda in play right now. And so I mentioned the solar tariffs moratorium that keeps that industry sort of vibrant after roughly 10 years of some difficult conditions because of the dumping by Chinese manufacturers into the U.S. So you maintain some stability there, particularly for the installers. Electric vehicles, we're seeing quite an uptake of EVs and needing the supporting infrastructure there. So once again, we see again some plans for stability and growth in the EV industry, and even private industry has invested or pledged to invest $100 billion into the electric vehicle industry. And now we have the offshore wind industry, and looking at what California is doing, what the state of New York is doing, and now some opportunities in the Gulf Coast. So this represents a cohesive strategy. And why? Well, we've seen over the past 4 months the instability caused by the Russia invasion of Ukraine. And so we've seen energy prices soar. We've seen issues with energy insecurity, particularly in a country like Japan, which has been impacted as it relates to its affiliations with the G7, its alliances, but then also having partnerships with the Russian Federation for natural gas exploration, in which it imports 8% of its liquid natural gas resources. So we can see how the U.S. and Europe are moving very aggressively to ensure their energy security, and it's vital to maintain grid stability and resiliency. And the positions that the European Union and the United States have taken against Russia are certainly going to present some challenges to that end. So now the focus is on a cohesive renewable energy policy, climate change policy out of the U.S. namely, and out of the European Union. It remains to be seen what's going to happen out of Asia, and using Japan specifically as an example. But one other thing to consider is that Biden has invoked the Defense Production Act for many of these renewable energy initiatives. And what does that mean? Well, Defense Production Act is typically something that's used in a wartime scenario, and that's related to having American companies manufacture on the behalf of the federal government for the good of the country. So, for example, an automaker can be mandated to produce tanks in a wartime scenario. An aviation company can be mandated to produce military aircraft in a wartime scenario. But that's not where we are right now. But we do have effectively a national security issue, as I mentioned earlier, with the Russia invasion of Ukraine and how that's caused energy insecurity worldwide. And so Biden has mandated the Defense Production Act for solar panels, for electric vehicle charging, and even for industries that are heavy carbon emitters. What can be done to transition those heavy carbon intensive industries over to green industry. So, for example, transitioning over to green hydrogen. So, there are some huge implications at play here. Okay, that sounds great. However, the Defense Production Act might seem a bit far fetched. Well, why is Biden doing this? As I mentioned, he has a climate agenda for 2030. And obviously, considering sort of the term of his presidency, it's in his interest politically to see that through. However, there are currently discussions and debate in Congress about Biden's climate agenda and what American priorities should be. And Biden can't really wait for there to be determinations made around that. He might not get what he wants, or it might be a situation where America's climate policy falls short. And we've seen over the past 6 years or more with the previous administration, the U.S. sort of losing its position as it relates to climate policy. So Biden has effectively really sort of superseded the congressional sort of involvement as it relates to climate policy in America by invoking the Defense Production Act. We can certainly all hope that there is some meaningful agreement in Congress about what American priorities should be as it relates to climate policy. But as it stands right now, Biden has a very aggressive agenda as it relates to his climate policy with targets for 2024, but his overall climate targets or climate policy targets for 2030. Okay, so on to the European Union. So there have been some interesting developments out of the European Union over the past week as well. So, namely, the European Commission has voted to uphold its ban on fossil fuel vehicles, meaning gas and diesel vehicles, by 2035. Now, that doesn't mean that there's an official ban. It means that their agenda, the European Commission's agenda, has been approved to negotiate with European Union member countries for the ban of ICE vehicles, fossil fuel vehicles, by 2035. And so there are some implications around that. What that means is they're taking away the incentives for vehicles that qualify for zero and low emissions, meaning it's no longer necessary. And that's going to begin in 2024, meaning that vehicles can only emit about 7 grams of CO2 per kilometer, all the way down to 4 kilograms of CO2 per kilometer before the 2035 ban takes effect. That puts auto manufacturers in an extraordinarily difficult position, because it's going to be difficult to sell gas vehicles in the European Union by 2035, effectively canceling out the ability to sell vehicles in that market when the 2035 ban takes effect. So there are manufacturers who support this, Ford and Volvo namely, but there are other manufacturers who are really going to struggle with this, and that would include Honda and Toyota, for example, who currently don't have the types of vehicles that are going to meet the European Union's requirements by 2035. So certainly it's going to create some challenges for several auto manufacturers. So interesting to see what happens there. Now, moving on to the European Union, again, Germany. So Germany has announced plans for an expansion of wind energy, 80% of its electricity from renewable energy sources by 2030. So they want to increase their onshore wind capacity to 115 gigawatts. That's about enough power for 34 million homes. But it gets even more interesting. Germany is being very aggressive about its wind energy plans. And what that means is that they are looking to accelerate the expansion of wind energy. Why are they doing that? Well, Germany is heavily dependent on Russian energy resources. About 40% of Russia's energy resources comes from Russia. And again, given the position they've been put in with the Russia invasion of Ukraine, the sanctions levied against the Russian Federation, and then also the demands that the Russian Federation has on payments for natural gas and for oil, for example, it has created a huge sort of energy security situation for Germany. So they are looking at expanding that rapidly. even to the point that if there are no agreements from Germany states about the deployment of onshore wind energy, the German government, the German ministry, can deploy wind energy resources close to homes. And even though I'm an advocate of renewable energy, that is something to really be concerned about when you place large wind turbines close to residential areas. One, because of noise. Two, because of sort of the rotation of the turbine as it relates to constant fluttering of light in the area, and then even sort of how they appear in the landscape. So certainly this has huge implications as it relates to Germany and for the German population as well. So certainly interested in seeing what happens there and whether this can be done both rapidly but with consideration for the sort of balance of local communities within Germany. So interesting to see what will happen there. Moving on, the European Union has also talked about a program called RePower EU. And this program was announced at the end of May. Just some parameters around this, talking about a $210 billion investment in renewable energy and in energy conservation by 2027. So that's a huge investment in less than 5 years' time, talking over $40 million per year, $40 billion per year by 2027. Huge investment. Where is the money coming from? Number one. Now, okay, that's great. We've talked about renewable energy expansion plans inside the U.S., the Biden administration's climate agenda, but this is something out of the European Union that is quite ambitious and quite aggressive. Well, one of the tenets of the RePower EU plan is to cut dependency on Russian energy resources by 2/3 by the end of this year. How is that possible? There's no clarification on what the European Union's plan is to sort of reduce its dependency that aggressively by the end of the year. And then the broader target is to fully reduce its dependency on Russian fossil fuel resources by 2027. It sort of seems like it should be the inverse, maybe reducing energy resources from Russia by 1/3 this year and the remaining 2/3 by 2027. I don't know how it's going to be done. I've had some discussions with other professionals in the renewable energy industry about this, and certainly we all share the same questions. Where is the money coming from? Is the burden placed on residents within the EU to fund this $210 billion RePower EU initiative? Meaning, does fuel become more expensive to power homes, to power vehicles? Are there mandates for people to install solar energy on their homes? Who is going to pay for that? Where are the subsidies going to come from? Where are tax breaks and incentives going to come from? So something very interesting to watch to that end. So in contrast, I haven't talked about Asia or Asia Pacific, but Japan is currently in a situation with huge energy insecurity, and there are no such measures in place. So I've talked about in this podcast a lot about the United States and to a lesser extent the European Union. But in the next podcast, I want to look at Asia Pacific, so Japan, South Korea, as well as Australia and New Zealand, and what their ambitions are. So thanks for checking this out. I know it was a lot to cover. Love to hear your thoughts on this and your perspectives, your ideas. Do you think any of this is feasible? Do you think it's wise? Do you think these expansions and these initiatives are happening too aggressively? Have we had a chance to really kind of in the past 3 months, 4 months since the Russian invasion of Ukraine to really get some perspective around this? Or are we headed down the right track with these types of considerations? So love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for checking out this video. Once again, my name is Mark Weich. We are on your favorite podcast platform and your social media platform as well. So feel free to like and subscribe, as well as leave your feedback on anything we produce here. And also don't forget to check us out on the web as well. We are at Cenergy.co, CENRG.co. Look forward to seeing you there. Everything we talk about here, you can find us or find published on our website there. So once again, thanks for checking us out.